Namaskar and welcome back to another power-packed episode of Media Scan, your weekend dose of headlines, controversies and perspectives. First, the disruption in the national capital because the leader of a political party was being questioned by investigative agencies, and then the distressing visuals of violence, arson and vandalizing in many states. This was a week where headlines were more about protests than anything else. We will discuss some of those certainly, but first up, what made news? A young, lean and radically modern military is what India needs to stay abreast with the times. It is with the same that the scheme Agneepath was announced earlier this week for all the armed forces. Young men and women who qualify as Agniveers will serve a short-term service of 4 years in the age group of 17.5 to 21 years, with an age relaxation for the first round this year. At the end of the service, they will get an assured amount along with preference in the recruitment in paramilitary and various state police services. Meanwhile, the media has been abuzz with reports of protests in some states and disturbing visuals of widespread arson, vandalizing of public property, stone pelting by some groups who are demanding rollback of the Agneepath scheme. We will discuss these aspects in detail in just a few moments. Just before the Agneepath scheme, Prime Minister Narendra Modi highlighted a renewed thrust on employment by announcing that at least 10 lakh more personnel would be appointed in various government ministries, departments and agencies on mission mode in the next 1.5 years. Consequently, ministries and departments have begun the exercise of reviewing their manpower so as to kickstart the ambitious appointment drive. Congress MP Rahul Gandhi was questioned for 3 consecutive days by the Enforcement Directorate with regard to various financial dealings in the National Herald case this week. As the questioning continued, Congress workers and even chief ministers protested in the national capital as well as some other places against the investigation. Incidents of burning tires and even assaulting police personnel were reported at some places. Rahul Gandhi's questioning will resume on Monday. Congress President Sonia Gandhi has also been summoned by ED, but she is currently in hospital following post-COVID complaints. The demand for the arrest of Nupur Sharma following her remarks on Prophet Muhammad soon turned into violent demonstrations, slogans of beheading and even threats of burning down the country. The government imposed prohibitory orders in most places and hundreds of troublemakers were arrested during the week. Meanwhile, the Islamic State Khorasan province issued a threat of attacking India, thus indicating that foreign powers were doing their best to play upon the fault lines. Amidst confusion about who would actually steer the opposition ranks for the July presidential polls, leaders of various parties met in the national capital this week to chalk out their strategy. But major opposition parties ruling in various states such as the Biju Janata Dal, the Telangana Rashtra Samiti, the YSRCP and Aam Aadmi Party stayed away from the meet, signalling lack of cohesion in the opposition bloc. On the other side, Senior Minister Rajnath Singh and BJP President JP Nadda also spoke to various party heads for wider support in the election of the next President of India. Neither the government nor the opposition have so far announced any names for a candidate. So those were some of the headlines which you saw across media platforms through the week. Viewers, as already highlighted, right in the beginning of the week, the Prime Minister reiterated his commitment to a renewed thrust on employment, which included at least 10 lakh jobs in the coming 1.5 years. A very important component of this renewed thrust would be Agneepath, which is a scheme for recruitment in the armed forces, a radical revolutionizing program in which short-term services will be given a chance to youngsters, young men and women of the country who want to join the armed forces around the age group of 17 and a half up to 21 years. Seeing some of the concerns of the students or the aspirants in the country, the government has already displayed within 2 days a tendency to incorporate suggestions that are coming from the aspirants and other experts by allowing an age relaxation of a few years to up to 23 years to be precise for the first round of recruitments, since a lot of people were complaining about the recruitment freeze due to COVID. But in spite of this leniency on the government side and the efforts by top functionaries in the government, in the armed forces, by many of our veterans, a lot of reservations and doubts and questions have been raised on Agneepath, both from retired officers and personnel of the armed forces as well as aspirants in various parts of the country. These questions and reservations, which began in the form of doubts, have now very quickly turned into arson, vandalizing of public property, open violence, stone pelting, attack on police personnel and much more. So, what is so questionable about the Agneepath scheme? Is it really such a dangerous proposition that the country should be put into flames for the sake of the scheme that has just been announced? Or has politics overtaken the concerns over the scheme? To answer all these questions, I have a very interesting panel of guests here with me this evening. Allow me to introduce on Media Scan this evening Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, a veteran of the Indian Army. Many of you recognize him as the hero of Siachen. You have heard him on Media Scan on several earlier occasions. Welcome back, General Kulkarni, and it's a great pleasure to have you, sir, as I am sure you will be able to explain to us better than anybody else from a military aspect and a human aspect what really entails the Agneepath scheme and whether it is really something to be worried about. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. At the very outset, to have invited me to clarify certain of the doubts which have occurred in the minds of the people on the Agneepath scheme. First, to begin with, at the very outset, I must say...
I'll come to you, sir. Allow me just a second. I'll come back to you on the merits of the scheme. But before that, may I introduce our second guest for the evening, Tushar Gupta, well-known journalist, political commentator. You have been reading him on the Swaraj and hearing him on television channels. I'm happy to have Tushar Gupta on Media Scan for the first time. Welcome, Tushar Gupta, and I hope we'll have a fruitful conversation.
Thank you so much, Netaji.
Perfect. And with that, I come back to General Kulkarni on what we were just about to get on with the discussion. General Kulkarni, sir, the government, senior functionaries within the government as well as some veterans like you and serving officers, particularly the Army Chief, the Air Force Chief and even the Vice Chief General Raju have been explaining to the youngsters and other people in the country why it is necessary to have a scheme like the Agneepath program if we want to have a really lean, a young and a modern, according to the times, military. However, you must have seen reports of the protest in several states of the country. Do you really think, sir, on two counts? One, the question of re-employment of these personnel, men and women, and secondly, on the issue of their further studies to prepare themselves for some other profession. On both these counts, are such protests or at least the questions justified, even if we leave aside the protests, the apprehensions? Your take, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. At the very outset, I must inform our viewers that it's a very, very transformative scheme, firstly. Secondly, it is the only way that people will now get recruited into the army, that is the Agneepath scheme, to which they will become Agniveers for 4 years. And before we even start with what we're going to say, I must at the very outset be conveying, this is extremely, extremely sad that the youth have to resort to this kind of violence, wherein the government property is to be destroyed. I don't think this is the right way to even express your anger, anguish, or apprehension. There are various ways. The scheme has just got rolled out, and I'm so glad you asked me as to why these apprehensions are there. What is it that has caused such kind of, which has led to this violence amongst the state? Difficult to say whether they were instigated or whether they've actually not understood what the scheme is all about, and maybe better lack of communication gap which has occurred. First, very at the outset, I must tell you, like you rightly brought out, it's a scheme for recruitment in the armed forces for youth, both girls and boys at the age of 17 and a half to 21, and they would get enrolled into the army this way only, having done the 10th standard. Now, having said that, these children who get recruited into the army for as Agneepath would stay for 4 years, having got trained in these 4 years for 6 months in the respective regimental centers, and then for 3.5 years in the armed forces. There is no dilution of the recruitment standards whatsoever, number one. Number two, it is all India, all class. That is the most important thing, and no dilution, no this thing. So what is it that this scheme actually gives us? It gives us the tech-savvy demographic dividend, which would result in the youth profile, the average age, which otherwise was of the Javans of about 35.
On this point, sir, I just have a quick query which I saw being raised by many so-called experts, and we need to really clarify this from someone like you. There was a question being raised that perhaps the only motivation behind the government in bringing the scheme was to cut the flap, because pension burden is getting higher every day, and with OROP the burden may have become much bigger, and also because the government wants to save money through this by putting the armed forces into jeopardy. Is that apprehension or the doubt justified in any way?
See, definitely not. I must at the very outset tell you that the government's intention is not to save money on soldiers to be able to put anybody into jeopardy, and definitely not the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of the nation. That is very, very important. There is no question of money being saved. That may be a fallout, not immediately, could be after 20 years or 30 years, there would be saving. Definitely there is a need to cut the flap. There is definitely a need to improve teeth to tail ratio. There is definitely a need to improve to be able to get bang for the buck for the money has been invested by the government. We are obviously not able to spend as much as we want. Every government, any government for that matter, will have this restriction of spending money. Notwithstanding that, definitely money is not what is guiding the entire scheme. What is guiding is to get the youth who are tech savvy to exploit the demographic dividend and to be able to get them into the army, and once they have joined the army, to keep the best 25% and release 75%, having given them skill, having made them from what it could be said from boys to becoming men. Also a cash incentive of almost what they call Seva Nidhi of up to almost 12 lakhs, a non-contributory insurance of 48 lakhs, a disability of almost 44 lakhs. Should a person die during this period, he would get almost 1 crore that his family would get, and not just that, till he would have, his family will continue to get this amount till he is an Agneepath. If he dies, say for instance, by whatever the reason it may be in the very first year.
Right. I think General Kulkarni, we have all gone through those provisions, which have been spread widely across by various government platforms, and veterans like you have also been trying to sensitize people, and yet we know that the protests are not only continuing, but in fact they are becoming more and more violent, as we have seen reports towards the weekend. So please allow me to bring in Tushar Gupta here, so we are able to understand what might be behind these protests, apart from some doubts over the scheme. Tushar Gupta, coming to you, it was barely 24 hours that the Agneepath scheme was announced, and we saw some sporadic protests break out in some parts of eastern India. From then on, they have been sort of not only multiplying geographically, but the protests have also become very, very violent. to the extent that scores of police personnel, men and women, have been injured, seriously injured, and now there are threats of shutting down the country, literally, throwing the country into flames. My question to you, Tushar Gupta, is, do you think this is an organic protest? Because there was hardly time to even understand the provisions of the scheme before, such protests broke out in quick succession in a sort of organized way all over the country. Do you think politics is at play? And if yes, what is the best way for governments, for states and the center to remove the apprehensions and, cut the politics from the actual questions so that peace can come back?
So I'll answer this in 3 different steps. First, was this an organic protest? Absolutely not. But I have to very unfortunately inform you that in the past, the protests we're now beginning to see, especially the ones like these where public property is vandalized, where arsonists are visible, they're not bothered about the provisions or the policy. They're just there to protest, to create a ruckus. We saw that with the CAA. We saw that with the farm laws. We saw that with the labor reforms. People started imagining an NRC draft bill and they were protesting against something they had imagined. So clearly no one is interested in the policy or the provisions, and so is the case with the Agneepath program, the Agneeveer program. People are not interested in the provisions. People are not interested in what the policy can do for the military forces, for the youth of the country, for the overall system of the country. They're not interested. They want to protest on the roads. The second question is, how should the government react to this? See, the problem is of not the government here. The problem is of the mindset of the protesters. I have posted a lot of tweets on my social media accounts since yesterday, and I got some very interesting responses, Mataji. But I read all through these responses, which is something I always do, and I found 2 big problems, just 2 main problems. One, people are angry that there is no pension.
Right.
If you look at it, the first question they're asking is, where is the pension? Because the whole idea behind pursuing a government job, any job, be it UPSC, be it a bank exam, be it the military, is we get a pension. Now, who can explain them that for 4 years of service, which might get over at the age of 25, assuming you're joining at the age of 21, which is the upper limit, how can you
Tushar
expect
Gupta,
the government...
allow me a quick query
Yes.
here. Leaving aside the politics of it, you really cannot fault a candidate for worrying about financial security later in life. I mean, that is a genuine concern, or isn't it?
No, it's not. It's not. We work in the private sector. There are no pensions guaranteed. There are retirement plans people work on. A majority of Indians today are employed in the private sector.
Correct.
Do people care about the pensions when they join an Infosys or a TCS? I graduated as an engineer. At 22, 23, you're not worrying about the pension that may come to you. That's a sense of entitlement. That's the mindset I'm talking about. People are not angry about the provisions or the time duration or anything else, or the regiment, or what it will do to the recruitment process. They're actually not. Their main anger is, how can you deny us pension in a government job that we deserve pension for at least 40 years, assuming they live up to 65 years or more, for 4 years of service? In which part of this universe is that justified? Can you give someone pension for 40 years for a service they have been in for 4 years? The second question they keep asking is...
Right, point taken. But there's another query here. There is, that's fine, Tushar Gupta, but there is one more query here. How do you reason out, suppose you're concerned about changing the mindset of people towards a government job, whether the armed forces or other sectors. The question is, how do you reason on provisions and terms, etc., with a section of people who are not even worried about damaging the same public property that they would be serving in the coming days to come?
Smitaji, one thing, the people who are on the streets today, arsoning, burning trains, painful images. They are never going to be recruited in any of the government jobs anyway. These are not people who are interested in getting a job. These are people interested in creating a ruckus. Nevertheless, my stand has always been, and I've written extensively about this, that the state should invest in low-flying drones with facial recognition systems. The people who are caught, booked and convicted legally, I emphasize the word convicted here, not suspects but convicted, should be debarred from any government exam for the rest of their lives. They should be cut off from the subsidies and other welfare schemes. It's a radical stand, but that is what I firmly believe. Because if you have to deter protesters for tomorrow, you have to have some very harsh measures, because tomorrow they'll be on the streets for everything. That's the part of dealing with people who are radicals.
It is certainly radical what you are flagging, Tushar Gupta, but point taken. Allow me to come back to General Kulkarni quickly on one related issue, and then I shall come back to you more on the what do you think is the politics behind the entire, spate of protests. General Kulkarni, sir, you heard Tushar Gupta saying that apprehensions, this has to be dealt at in a two-pronged manner. On the one side, we have to remove the doubts and apprehensions in the mind of the youngsters, but at the same time, people who are ready to take the law in their hands without even going into the merits of the entire program, they need to be dealt with an iron hand. But sir, there are some very serious concerns, and more than the youngsters, if I may say, I am hearing the veterans raise this question more than anybody else. That is about, we will have a set of young men and women in the country without any relevant skill sets for the rest of their life, and with arms training at their disposal, which will become a threat to the security, the social fabric of the country. Is that going too far, or can this be a genuine concern? Your take, sir.
Firstly, I just would clarify certain apprehensions. The apprehensions probably, as I see in the mind of the protesters, is of those 75% who are not likely to get absorbed in the services, and there's where the apprehensions lie, that only 25% are getting absorbed, the training being what it is, and everybody on the same platform. Why 75% are being told to leave, and why only the best 25% are being taken? So that's the apprehension. It probably that apprehension can be addressed and forthwith by communicating to them that it is absolutely wrong to consider that these 75% are not going to be taken care by the government. The government has come forward with promises. However, having said this, I would say these promises must be converted into notifications, so that reservations, whether it is in the CAPF or whether it is group C&D employees, whether it is the state police force, whether it is in the railways, whether it is in the banks or the bank loans to be given to them, everything can be notified, and that notification will probably assure them that they are not going to be on the street, and that would again take away those apprehensions of people who feel that they might just fall into some wrong hand. They wouldn't. How would they fall into wrong hands? Because they have all been trained so well, they would be disciplined, they would be, they would have the same kind of commitment and the desire and the motto for which each one of us in the armed forces are Naam, Namak, Nishan. So there is no question of that. Only thing is a miscommunication. Somebody probably is, or even normally, as I would say, even some of the veterans or themselves also have certain apprehensions in mind. So those apprehensions.
So I'd like to ask Tushar Gupta also about that miscommunication, factor that you are raising. But before that, very quickly, sir, I have very little time left on the show with me. What in your perspective, in your understanding of similar practices in other countries of the world? I know there is no ditto model of the Agneepath scheme in any other country in the world, but there are similar programs being pursued by various countries in Europe, in the US, etc. What do you think has been their experience? Have they been subjected to untoward violence or any threat to the social fabric, or any of these serious concerns that are being voiced in our country in the past 3 days?
Now, what it is, ma'am, in all other countries, whether it is UK, USA, China, Israel, France, whichever country that we take, there is conscription and there is volunteer conscription also. So there are these kind of things. General impression is it's only 6 months of training. All these countries, they have only 10 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 weeks, that kind of a training, and then they're brought in, say, for 1 year, some countries 6 months, some countries 4 years, so China is 2 years. So it is all across the country. So these models are there. However, having said that, well, even if we say that our country is different because our aspirations are different, people come from rural areas, they are really very, very poor, and therefore it helps them to raise the standards of living, it helps them to look after the family, and things of those kind, and enjoy the perks of being a part of a government. Yes, there are schemes across the world, and this particular scheme that we've introduced has been introduced with a view to strengthen the armed forces, to enhance the combat potential, to use the tech savviness of the demographic dividend of this particular youth. And again, I would reiterate that 25% who get absorbed, say for instance in an infantry battalion, if 40 boys join as Agniveers, 30 will be released, 10 will be selected as sepoys, and those 30, the government will make all endeavors to absorb them into various, for which I have said, I request the government not just assurances, but converting the assurances into notification, so that raises the morale of these boys and girls, that it is not that they are left in the street. Not just that, who can, for getting a skill certificate, ensuring, changing the mindset, disciplining him, giving him skill, giving him 12 lakhs of rupees, even at the end, and all these Agneeveers getting 12 lakhs and getting all these government jobs subsequently.
And
which are
even those Agneeveers, men and women both, who do not get absorbed into a regular government job, say in the paramilitary or other agencies, would be having enough incentives to start any kind of work of their own which they would like to invest their future into. But on that question of communications, I would like to bring in Tushar Gupta here. Tushar Gupta, we cannot just wish away politics. There will be politics, and there are powers ready to play upon the fault lines in our social fabric to create as much ruckus, and not just ruckus but serious repercussions for the peace of the country. However, on that question of communication, what do you think the government, the government has already displayed a very lenient attitude by announcing the jobs in the CAPFs. Many chief ministers have announced similar schemes in their state police and other agencies. Similarly, there has been an effort on the media platforms to explain the benefits accruing from the entire scheme. And let us be pragmatic. I mean, we do need to bring in reforms in the country. We cannot continue to carry on the way we were 6 decades or 5 decades ago. Yet, do you think there has been something lacking on the communication side? And if yes, what would be the best way to address it? Or are we going to see worse protests in the coming days?
Smitaji, I would have said about that the communication was a problem when CA happened or FAM laws happened, and even the NRC NPR was being discussed. But here it's not a communication problem. Here it is a mindset problem. Today, if 1,000 students enroll in the Agneepath program, 250 will make it, 750 will have to leave after 4 years. If 1,000 people appear for UPSC, one of them clears the exam. That's how the probability works. But you never hear any political party, any student asking on the ground, what about people who have not been able to crack UPSC? What will the government do for them? Over here, you have the Seva Nidhi package. The government will obviously make them available for Mudra loans and other schemes where they can get access to credit to start work, do businesses, go for higher education and whatnot. Their education is not suffering because IGNOU is designing a course specially for them where they can avail the credits and then further pursue their studies.
Tushar Gupta, since I have very little time left with me, very quickly, sir, you have been stressing on the need to change the mindset toward government jobs, through the show. I mean, how really can we do it except that we can keep better explaining the provisions and the benefits? I mean, do you have anything in mind?
For starters, it's a big question, but I'll answer it shortly.
Yes.
Make assessment, periodic assessment compulsory every 3 or 5 years in every public sector job. Be it a bank, be it the military, everywhere. However the assessment needs to happen, that will be taken care by the seniors or experts in that field. But an assessment needs to happen because today the people you see protesting on the streets, bothered about the Agneepath program, these are not patriots, these are not nationalists. These are opportunists looking for a lifelong pension in a government job. This is not the mindset we need to serve this country, be it in the military, be it in a bank, be it in any public service. That's my concern.
So, you are saying that apart from bringing important, far-reaching and much-awaited reforms in the government mechanism, it is perhaps time to change, the reform the way we look at our future as men and women, as citizens of the country. But I am afraid at this interesting point, I'll have to put a stop to this discussion. I know it was a vast subject, but we've tried to pack in as much as possible. And perhaps one of these evenings we shall have the opportunity to revisit the subject, and hoping that the country will see more peaceful times by the time we have our next discussion on the subject. General Sanjay Kulkarni, thank you so much, sir. You are always so kind to join our show whenever we have requested you. We hope to have your good counsel in the future for the benefit of our audience and our viewers. Thank you again, General Kulkarni.
Thank you, ma'am. Jai Hind.
And Tushar Gupta, thank you for joining Media Scan for the first time. It was a great experience conversing with you, and we hope to have your perspective in our future episodes as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Looking forward. Thank you.
Viewers, it has been the view of experts across channels, across media platforms, that the country cannot wait anymore to introduce much needed reforms, which perhaps should have been introduced many years ago. But now that the leadership of the country is attempting to bring in reforms in various sectors, there is a segment of people, there is a section of citizens who are not ready to accept these reforms, and certainly there are bigger powers in the background who are trying to play upon these fault lines to create chaos in the country. We have to find our way through this chaos, try our best to put the apprehensions of the citizens at rest, and perhaps deal with those who are hell-bent on creating trouble in the country with a firmer hand. On that note, it's a wrap-up on Media Scan for the evening, but do keep watching DD India as we shall continue to scan the media for you. Namaskar.